Ladies and gentlemen, we're grateful this evening for the extraordinary support of the William E. Simon Foundation, which has made this conference possible. William Simon, Sr., made a name for himself at Salomon Brothers in New York as a senior partner in charge of the government and municipal bond department. George Shultz introduced Simon to President Nixon and into the Nixon administration as Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. The President's executive office had to be virtually rebuilt in April 1973 after the departures of Bob Haldeman and John Ehrlichman. So Secretary Simon later wrote in his book, quote, "One morning, shortly after my swearing in, I was working in my office when George Shultz stopped by. What do you know about the oil import policy of the United States?" "Nothing," he replied. "Well, the President wants you to take a look at it. He decided that you should be the head of the Oil Policy Committee." "George, you know I will gladly do whatever you and the President want me to do, but I don't know anything about oil or oil policy." George Shultz shrugged. "You'll learn." And learn he did, commanding the oil import program as the Nixon administration's domestic troubles were mounting. He didn't believe that the mistakes at the end of the Nixon administration should overshadow the good work that occurred during Richard Nixon's 5.5 years in office, from its groundbreaking domestic reforms to its truly world-altering foreign policy. He thought that Richard Nixon deserved more than he got. And that loyalty never wavered. After Bill Simon's years in public office, he never missed a chance to support the Nixon story and legacy. As the Nixon Library project went from sketches to designs to buildings, Secretary Simon assumed the top job at the Nixon Library in 1981, only 7 years after the President's resignation, as founding chairman of the Richard Nixon Library and Birthplace. His early, significant support, and that of his wife Carol, helped to ensure the survival of the Nixon Foundation and Library in its earliest days. More recently, the Simon family and foundation contributed to the beautiful renovation which produced the new Nixon Library, which I hope that all of you have had a chance to see, and which all of visitors from all over the world enjoy now. So tonight, we celebrate Secretary Simon's extraordinary all-American life and the special friendship that he shared with Richard Nixon and the Nixon family, which endures to this day. And before his sons speak this evening, we found a blast from the past called "A Day in the Life of America's Energy Czar." So let's roll that now.
Simon's day begins before his children wake up, and they're usually asleep when he gets home. Breakfast with his wife, and then Simon is off and running. To set an example, Simon uses his own car instead of a gas-guzzling government limousine, but he has a government chauffeur and telephone. It's not yet 7 a.m. most mornings when Simon arrives at the Treasury Department. His 16-hour day is constant motion. Simon receives a procession of governors, mayors, and other officials.
Okay, Bill. Bye-bye. God bless, Abe.
Thank you. Simon repeatedly tells congressional committees of the need to use less gasoline in order to save fuel for industry and jobs. But some congressmen criticize Simon for his reluctance to go to gas rationing. News conferences are frequent and often on the run. Oil executives are told by Simon they must use their big profits to explore for new oil.
Well, you better stay calm because we've got a lot of decisions to make, and we're trying to help an awful lot of people, and we're dealing with a shortage. That's the problem. I usually eat right here at my desk. I have a sandwich and a Coke every day for lunch, and try as often as I can to have someone come in and share a sandwich with me so we can talk while we're eating, and I can get some business done at the same time.
Those who work with Simon admire the way he has organized his agency to cope with the energy crisis. But critics say he drives people too hard.
I want to know what's being done, and I gave you loads of other things to take a look at what's being done, too. I expect them followed up. Thank you. I have the usual faults of a human being. Perhaps more, I'm impatient, and I understand that. It's only a dark cloud that passes very quickly, and people realize that. But I like to believe at the same time that I don't demand any more of other people than I demand of myself.
In a city where power is measured by an official's access to the president, few people see President Nixon as often as Simon does. This has won him enemies in the administration who say he reaches for too much power.
Events have been occurring so rapidly that you don't have the normal luxury of being able to communicate with all the people all the time. So I'm sure there's resentment at everything that I'm trying to do, and I guess that's part of the job.
In an administration often characterized by secrecy and hostility to the press, Simon is available and friendly to reporters, granting frequent interviews to try to convince the public that the oil shortage is real.
By placing the facts before the American people, I think that's a healthy thing to do. Defining the exact degree of shortfall that tells the people what they have to do in order to avoid it. During the week, if I get out now once every month, it's a lot. And I guess that's a penalty on Carol. And I would hope there again that that's a short-lived thing. Ambitions? I guess everybody's ambitious. I'm ambitious to get a job done that I've been given to do. Someday, maybe down here toward the end of my tenure, whenever that is, I'll have the luxury to maybe reflect a little about what I should do when I leave government. It's going to be hard because this has been and continues to be such a stimulating, diversified existence that some suggest that I could not go back to the relatively slow pace. We'll see.
Good evening, and welcome to the Nixon Library and Birthplace National Energy Conference. I am Peter Simon, and for nearly 25 years I've carried on our dad's tradition of Nixon Foundation board membership, and I always enjoy coming back to Yorba Linda, especially seeing all the work we've just finished. I'm here with Brother Bill, who you'll be hearing from later. We are co-chairs of the William E. Simon Foundation, and we're proud to be sponsoring this Nixon National Energy Conference here at the library. It wasn't energy that brought our dad, Bill Simon, and President Nixon together back in 1972, but it was energy that forged their friendship that assured their place together in history. Of course, it almost didn't happen. The story has been often told, and no one told it more often than Dad, about the president's initial reaction when Bill Simon's name was mentioned as a possible appointee for the second term. The memo came back with a line drawn through Dad's name and a big handwritten, "No, East Coast establishment. Options?" A second submission produced the same result, but the third try was lucky. It resulted in an invitation to Camp David, and once they met, the rest was history. President Nixon and Dad shared a fierce patriotic passion, and when this opportunity presented itself, our beautiful mother, Carol, packed up the 7 of us kids, and we relocated to the D.C. area, McLean, Virginia. One of Dad's proudest accomplishments was to serve as the Secretary of the Treasury during a very tumultuous time. Years later, in 1981, Dad became the founding president of the Nixon Library Foundation. This, how shall I put this, was not exactly a plum job in 1981. But for Dad, it was a debt of honor and a labor of love. Nixon was not, how shall I put this, an easy sell back in 1981. But of course, Dad persisted. That's what Dad did. And they raised the money and broke the ground. And in 1990, they opened this magnificent place. How will I remember that? And both President Nixon and the president of the Nixon Library Foundation were especially proud that this was the first presidential library to operate without taxpayer funds. Yay! To be here at the library for the Nixon National Energy Conference, marking the 50th anniversary of the first presidential message to the Congress about energy, is very special for me, for my brother, for our family, and for the Family Foundation. This kind of informed, thoughtful, freewheeling, and respectful discussion of an important and timely issue is exactly the kind of event that Richard Nixon and Bill Simon would have loved, and that they wanted this library to encourage and inspire. To everyone here in this spectacular replica of the White House East Room, welcome. To everyone watching on live stream, or who will be watching or on demand in the future, welcome. Don't be strangers. Come back to your Belinda. Take a look, take another look at the life, the times, and the legacy of our consequential 37th president, Richard Nixon, and his remarkable First Lady, Pat. And for now, enjoy your desserts, thank you, and good night.
On April 18, 1973, 50 years ago, President Nixon sent to the Congress the first ever presidential message dealing with energy. Because the message was historic, and because it was meant to be a warning of the need for action, he took the unusual step of filming a clip from it.
America's energy demands have grown so rapidly that they now outstrip our energy supplies. As a result, we face the possibility of temporary fuel shortages and some increases in fuel prices in America. What is needed now is decisive and responsible action to increase our energy supplies, action which takes into account the needs of our economy, of our environment, and of our national security.
Until the early 1970s, energy in America had been a perk, not a problem. We wanted big cars, cool homes, jumbo jets, and there they were. Our appetite for energy seemed as insatiable as our supply of energy seemed unlimited. Energy hadn't even been an issue in the 1968 presidential campaign, or much of one in 1972. But by 1973, our demand for energy exceeded our supply. Today, we understand that energy has limits and imposes limits. But 50 years ago, with little context and no perspective, that was a very new, a very unsettling, and a very unpopular idea. In June 1971, following a number of electrical brownouts, natural gas shortages, and rising fuel prices, the president sounded an alarm by sending to Capitol Hill a full range of legislative proposals. 2 years later, in April 1973, President Nixon sent his historic first presidential energy message to Congress. That morning, he invited the joint congressional leadership to the White House for a briefing and a pep talk. He tried to convey a sense of urgency to them so they could help convey it to America.
This is the tough problem. There's a need for a massive program of information understanding in this area so that people don't feel that if you put a nuclear power plant up, it's going to poison their kids or give them this and that. My house in San Clemente is just 2 miles from the Edison nuclear power plant. And I'm afraid, but that's only because I suppose I've followed it enough. But the thing that I say is whether it's a nuclear power plant in that area, whether it's in the coal field in another area, whether it's in terms of how we handle this difficult problem of balancing automobile use of gas and environment with the energy consumption in another area. We've got to tackle these problems and tackle them now, or we will be, maybe even while I'm here, in a crisis. And what we've got to do is to avoid that crisis. I don't want as a problem, not a crisis, that I do not consider there's a great sense of urgency. There is a sense of urgency. But as far as the urgency is concerned, We must work urgently on the problem in order to avoid a crisis. And I'd like for you to consider our message. We'd like action in the legislation. We'd like your support in the information area.
At the end of June, by executive action, he combined two existing agencies into a new energy policy office and named Colorado Governor John Love as director, America's first energy czar. Czar Love surveyed the energy scene. In talking points he prepared for his first presidential briefing. The energy fuel shortage situation will be worse this winter than it was this summer. Given present policies, the situation will not improve for at least 3 years. Congressional action will not solve the immediate problem, but their inaction could make it worse. On the morning of October 6th, surprise attacks by Egypt and Syria threatened the safety and then the existence of the State of Israel. Over the next few weeks, President Nixon's decisive action, sending supplies, material, and money, would save Israel. But the day after Congress approved his $2.2 billion request for Israeli aid, Saudi King Faisal announced an embargo. America would have no Arab oil as long as it continued to support Israel. The embargo hit hard fast. Supplies dried up, prices rose, tempers flared, gas lines became a way of life. On November 7th, the president spoke from the Oval Office. His tone was calm but urgent.
As America has grown and prospered in recent years, our energy demands have begun to exceed available supplies. In recent months, we have taken many actions to increase supplies and to reduce consumption. But even with our best efforts, we knew that a period of temporary shortages was inevitable. Unfortunately, our expectations for this winter have now been sharply altered by the recent conflict in the Middle East. We must therefore face up to a very stark fact. We are heading toward the most acute shortages of energy since World War II.
Less than 3 weeks later, on November 25th, he was back with another primetime address announcing that gasoline for drivers and heating oil for homes would be cut by 15%, speed limits would be lowered to 50 miles per hour for cars and 55 for trucks and buses. Gas stations would be asked to close from 9 p.m. on Saturday until midnight Sunday. Jet fuel deliveries to domestic and international airlines would be limited. Christmas lighting would be curtailed. On December 4th, he created a new federal energy office and named William E. Simon as its first administrator. Suddenly, there was a new and no-nonsense czar in town. In Bill Simon, Nixon had found an ideal partner. Smart, tough, decisive, hard-charging, not afraid to ruffle some feathers, a quick study, and, apparently, not needing sleep. 1973 ended on a subdued note. At the end of the month, the President and First Lady set an example by taking a commercial flight home for their Christmas in California. On March 19, 1974, King Faisal announced that the oil embargo would end. Several years later, the former president applied some perspective to the Saudi king, the embargo, and its aftermath.
How would you describe the effect of both long-term and short-term on the United States of the Arab oil embargo in 1973?
Well, it was very detrimental in terms of the perception that Americans have of Saudi Arabia, the other oil-producing countries. After all, we don't like to sit in gas lines and have the price of gasoline go up and go through all the things that we did during that embargo. And of course, I was president at that time, and I've noted recently that they've got several billion ration tickets that they've now have to destroy because I wouldn't let rationing go ahead, thank God, when some were recommending it in the administration. But nevertheless, that perception of the Saudi Arabians as being basically anti-American, which was really not it so much as they're anti-Israeli. And I think Saudi Arabia, we have to recognize, too, had another problem. Saudi Arabia is not a very populous country. It's a very big country, and it's a very rich country. But almost half its population is Palestinian. And so under the circumstances, I think Faisal felt that the embargo had to go forward or the Palestinians had been in an uproar.
Do you think that the results of the oil embargo contributed to your downfall a year later?
Well, a number of things contributed to it. It didn't help. In fact, the fact that the recession began to develop, the oil embargo, of course, created more inflation, and that combined with the worldwide food shortage in 1973, 1974, helped to create the inflation, which later led to the recession. So it contributed to it, probably.
In his State of the Union address on January 23, 1974, the president noted another first.
In all of the 186 State of the Union messages delivered from this place in our history, this is the first in which the one priority, the first priority, is energy. Last week, I sent to the Congress a comprehensive special message setting forth our energy situation, recommending the legislative measures which are necessary to a program for meeting our needs. Just as 1970 was the year in which we began a full-scale effort to protect the environment, 1974 must be the year in which we organize a full-scale effort to provide for our energy needs, not only in this decade, but through the 21st century.
This would be his last State of the Union message. On August 9th, he resigned. President Nixon had many energy successes: the Alaska Pipeline, natural gas deregulation, the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit, the Energy Research Office, the International Energy Agency, support for mass transit, his environmental accomplishments. But perhaps his major legacy will be the example he gave of dedication, determination, and resilience when the public and their leaders didn't see change or weren't ready to accept it. He was disappointed but undeterred, coming back each year with new innovative ideas and proposing legislation. He did his duty as he saw it, and that may be his legacy to live by. Good evening, welcome. I'm Frank Gannon. I have the pleasure and privilege of leading a discussion tonight on the subject of Nixon and energy. To me, it's a fascinating history and backstory, one that's important, interesting, relevant to today, but largely unknown. When I called Professor Luke Nichter, who is here with his family tonight, Luke is indisputably the most knowledgeable man in the Western Hemisphere and probably in the world on the Nixon tapes. He said my request in 2023 was the first he'd had for energy content. Nixon was introduced to the subject of energy fairly early on in his administration, and it was exactly the kind of thing that would have and did intrigue him. It had a high nerd wonk quotient, so that box was ticked. So he could study alone in the Lincoln sitting room, and he could bring in people to learn from, and it was the kind of emerging thing that he liked to get on top of early, and so that he could ride the crest, and when it emerged and became important in politics, which was the payoff in a way, he would know all about it and be ready to help people understand it and learn from it. So he, as he would do, he got these people, he did the learning, he hired staff, and he took a very bold step in June of '71. He sent a message to the Congress with some major energy awareness legislation. And the result wasn't crickets, but it was crickets adjacent. It wasn't appreciated for what it was. There were a few headlines on various aspects of it, but it kind of disappeared. And this became sort of a pattern for the next couple of years. There would be an energy problem, and the administration, because he was on this curve, would respond. And it wasn't until really the Yom Kippur War in October of '73, the 50th anniversary of which is coming up soon, and the Arab oil embargo, which made everybody aware of energy, that public awareness caught up with his knowledge. The paradigm of this, I have a point and I'm getting to it. The paradigm of this was a press conference in November of '73. The oil embargo is at its height. People are going nuts with energy-related problems. He goes out, and it's AP editors. It's an hour-long press conference. There are 18 questions, and 16 of them are about Watergate. And so the last, literally, you couldn't make this up, the last question was about energy. And a hapless reporter from the Milwaukee Sentinel asked the question. It's this very short 2-minute clip you're about to see. And whatever you may think, trust me, President Nixon is showing extraordinary restraint in his answer to this question.
Yes, sir. I'm Joe Shope with Milwaukee Journal. Why didn't the administration anticipate the energy crisis several years ago, formulate a positive action plan to do something about it?
You walked into one there. And that's a great paper, incidentally, as is the Milwaukee Sentinel. But anyway, seriously, you see, what happened was that I sent the first energy message ever sent to the Congress. I sent it to the Congress over 2 years ago. I saw this thing coming. And you know why I saw it coming? Not because of the Mideast or the Alaska pipeline and the rest, but because this world, with all of its problems, is getting richer. Oh, I don't mean there aren't a lot of hungry people, not only in America, too many here, but if you want to see hungry people, go to India or go to some of the countries in Latin America or Upper Brazil, et cetera, et cetera. But generally, as the world gets richer, there's more air conditioning, there's more need for power, and there's more need for energy. And that's why I sent the message 2 years ago and asked at that time that the Congress consider a program so that the United States should become self-sufficient in energy. All right. I followed that up this year in April, before we even knew there might be, or had any idea of the Mideast crisis, which made a serious problem, a serious crisis. I asked them for 7 pieces of legislation to deal with energy. One has reached my desk, the Alaska pipeline. I signed it. The other 6, I hope they act before they go home for Christmas. Now, I'm not saying here the Congress is to blame. The President should have done something. What I do say is that the President warned about it, and the Congress did not act, even though he warned 2 years ago. The President warned April, the Congress did not act. And now it's time for the Congress to get away from some of these other diversions, if they have time, and get on to this energy crisis.
Tonight we have a streamlined but remarkable panel. We have a man who was present at the creation, in this case, of the Federal Energy Office, and a man who has written the book about the subject. That would be Jay Hakes, who was the director of the who was the director of the U.S. Energy Information Administration for President Clinton, and the director for research and policy for President Obama's BP Deepwater Horizon Oil Spill Commission. For 13 years, Jay was the director of the Jimmy Carter Library in Atlanta. And if you have been to Atlanta and haven't been to the library, you've missed something, and it's worth going to Atlanta just to go to that library. Jay has not only written the book on the subject, he's written books on the subject and articles. The most recent one, and relevant to tonight, from back in 2021, was the Energy Crises, Nixon, Ford, and Carter, and Tough Choices in the 1970s. I highly, highly recommend it. The man who was there was John Schaefer. We met back in the day in the West Wing of the Nixon White House. John was there from February of 72 to May of 74, and was a staff assistant to the president in the newly created Federal Energy Office. John's a graduate of the United States Naval Academy and has an MBA from the Harvard Business School. So to start, maybe, before we get, and you tell me how wrong everything I've said was, how did you all start being interested or involved with Nixon and energy? Start with you, John, and we have a picture of you from, there we are. What was your entree to the Nixon energy operation?
I've changed a bit since then. That was actually a White House photo. For the record, I actually never met one-on-one with Richard Nixon. I was not in the room when he was dealing with his senior staff, in my case, primarily Peter Flanagan, but also Bill Simon, who I worked directly for the last 6 months. But I always reported to someone who did report to the president. And many meetings began, well, I talked to the president, or I saw the president, and he said this, and he said that, and he wants to go here. So just a couple of things about background. In 1972, I got there about a year after the first energy message, which is the president clearly was proud of. It was the first. It was major. There were 11 major issues in it, most of which were repeated in the second energy message. But the government energy infrastructure was very decentralized. There was no need to control oil. The only existing oil was in the Office of Oil and Gas and the Bureau of Land Management. There was a mandatory oil import program, but that's because the New England states felt they could buy crude cheaper from the Middle East. There was the Federal Power Commission, the Atomic Energy Commission, but there was no real central power, and I'm sure Nixon knew that. And this is a long story, but very briefly, Peter Flanagan, like Haldeman and Kissinger and Ehrlichman, had assistant to the president's status, which was cabinet officer rank. And in my view, Peter was clearly the man closest to the president in the first year and a half on energy. He was the visionary. He was Nixon's action man. I came to the White House. I was essentially sent on temporary additional duty from the Department of Defense. I was an active duty naval officer for almost 2 years while I enjoyed the privileges of the White House staff, including being a member of the White House mess. So long story short, Peter and the president, I think, drove the first brilliant message, and then the president told Peter to get to work, and Peter put together at least 7 major interagency task forces. And as a result of that, as you just heard the president say, he had submitted 7 pieces of legislation. So Jay is much more qualified to judge presidential leadership, but it seems to me this is very bold. So I ought to pass the baton to Frank, but I would say that really represents the first year and a half I worked there. Right after the presidential energy message, John Love came in. And with all due respect to Governor Love, who I was quite close to, I immediately began working for him. He wasn't up for the job, but Bill Simon was. And that's sort of another story. And so we had a very disruptive summer of '73 with few real shortages, but perceived shortages. And then we had the Arab oil embargo. And again, I'll be quiet. if we have time, I have some observations about what really happened during the Arab oil embargo, because Bill put me in charge of it. So,
when you came, did you have an interest in energy, or you were an engineer from Annapolis, or what got you that gig, that slot?
when I was at the Department of Defense, after about a week, Mel Laird, Secretary of Defense, met with my boss, Assistant Secretary of Defense Bob Moot. I was 28 years old. He said, we're shipping 95% of fuel and munitions and everything else to Vietnam by sea. And I'm getting tremendous complaints from the Congress and the industry that we're not paying enough money, which was hundreds of billions of dollars. And so, John, I'd like you to go figure out what's happening. I didn't have a clue. But 6 months later, and he put together a task force that included the White House and the OMB and the Merchant Marine, or the Maritime Administration. So the White House thought I knew something about shipping, and when the president was trying to get his grain deal done with the Russians, after the first announcement that it was going to happen, the maritime unions, both seagoing and longshoremen, said no way. And that's when I went to the White House. They said, this is a kid at Defense that knows something about the Merchant Marine. So the next thing I know, I had a job in the White House.
Joe, what was your entree to energy and to Nixon energy?
Well, I was an academic during most of the time that President Nixon was at the White House, and there was something about that Arab oil embargo that just really caught my attention. It seemed to me it was a big deal internationally, it was a big deal domestically, and for reasons that I'll explain at more length if you're interested later, I've left the most tenured of professions for the least tenured of profession, oil and government and politics. And so when I had a chance to nudge my career, I would move towards this energy topic, which always was kind of like a magnet to me. So I sort of owe my career, I think, to the events of the Nixon era. On the energy side, those of you who don't follow energy carefully, the Energy Information Administration is the data and analytic part of the Department of Energy, and it's pretty independent. When I was there, my reports and data and anything else could not be overturned by the Secretary of Energy or by the White House or anybody else, and that's pretty rare in the federal government. So I think that time I testified before Congress 25 times, and one of the things I'm proud of is I authorized a report on the aftermath of the Arab oil embargo that was done in the 90s, because I still thought that was kind of the lodestar. Then I was the director of the Carter Presidential Library, and it occurred to me, wow, there's all these documents and film clips, some of which you're seeing tonight, that people haven't seen. Some of it was previously classified, or it hasn't been digitized, so people haven't seen it yet. So I thought I would combine my interest in presidential history and energy. And so for the last 20 years, much to my wife's dismay, I spend almost all my personal leave time going to presidential libraries. These speeches that you see here, I've gone through all 7 drafts of them. I know what staff person was pushing them to do one thing and another one was pushing a different point of view. So I started going to the presidential library, starting with Nixon and many of the others. And incidentally, the Simon papers are at Lafayette College, and that is a delightful place to do research. They treat researchers very well there. At the end, they said, would you like us to make all your copies for you? That's a golden offer for any researcher, because the part of it we hate is standing at a copy machine. Of course, now you get your iPhone and you take a picture. So I've gone through this a lot, and I'm now working on my third book that basically takes the foundations of the books are presidential documents and histories. I think I've listened to every tape where President Nixon is discussing energy, and they are very, very fascinating, whether it's with John Connally or Peter Flanagan or Whitaker. You get the real reality of government. The sort of sanitized version that we just get the surface. And behind the scenes, people are having very intelligent debates about very important issues. And so if you want to get into the weeds of this, you can read the book that Frank mentioned on energy crises. And I'm working on a third book on energy, which covers the climate change issue from Eisenhower through Bush 41. And that should be out next year. So I'm looking at it from I've been in government and I've worked for 6 federal agencies now. And so when I write, I think I've got some connection to the real world. But I also, now that I'm semi-retired, have the chance to really delve into these issues. And I really enjoy or appreciate the fact that you've invited me to participate tonight.
Professor Nichter found a couple of tapes that are fascinating of Nixon's conversations, one with Scoop Jackson and about energy, and one with Russell Long. And it's interesting. These guys had known each other since they were in the 40s when they were in the House or the Senate, and or vice president. And so these people who are very knowledgeable on different sides of the issue, sitting down and having deep discussions. The tapes, which have been a millstone around the Nixon neck for obvious reasons, are a vast and largely still untapped resource, because Watergate was discussed a minuscule percent, 4 or 5% of 3,700 hours, and the rest is some very, very interesting and deep policy stuff that gives a real insight into what Nixon was like when he forgot the tape was running and he was just talking to people. You've been talking a little bit about Peter Flanagan there, and you mentioned John Whitaker. So these are 3 people who were young staff aides coming from very different, dealing with energy, coming from very, very different routes. I have to explain that the picture of Charlie DeBona in the middle is this is an unpaid announcement. We couldn't show it big because it's got a watermark, and I didn't have time to buy it. It's from Historic Images, which, if you don't know it, is a great resource for historians or just for people, and it is a rabbit hole you can spend hours and hours and days down, because they're not original photos, but they're original news photos from on almost any individual, any topic, any subject, any event you can imagine. And so this is Charles DeBona, who testifying before Congress, and he's in the fall of '73, and what he's telling them is, I'm sure it was very popular, that in order to conserve fuel, they were probably going to have to close parks and stop Sunday driving. So that was him. But these, will you say something? In some of our discussions, you have talked about one of the unique aspects of Nixon was the staff, this very able, very young staff.
Yeah, let me talk about John Whitaker for a moment. Anybody who's going to talk about the legacy of Richard Nixon needs to learn a little bit about John Whitaker. And he wrote a book after he left the administration called A Delicate Balance. And I doubt that very many people in the room have read it, but if you can find a copy on Amazon, you might want to get it. Delicate balance is a very interesting concept. I think there's 2 ways to look at energy. One is it has to involve the environment, the economy, and national security. And if you're leaving out one of the 3, it's probably not a very good energy policy, and that's exactly what Nixon says. Now, Whitaker, when he talks about delicate balance, his prime example is offshore drilling. Because one of the things that President Nixon mentions in his these energy speeches that we've referred to is at one point he calls for tripling the amount of drilling on offshore federal lands. And that was pretty big, you know, we weren't going so deep back then, and that seemed like a big goal. You know, today we're going much deeper. But he would always add, subject to environmental and safety controls. And actually, Whitaker used the term schizophrenia within the administration when it came to offshore drilling, because when you balance the environment, you balance national security, it makes the decisions kind of complicated. But he was a very, well, all of these people actually, in my judgment, I sort of come to this trying not to have any preconceptions. You read their stuff today and it's very prescient and very high quality and dedicated to the public interest. And it was interesting because I hadn't met John before, but we had sort of come to the same conclusion about these individuals, me more from reading the documents that they wrote and circulated and commented on, and him from actually having worked with them. But these are not names that are household names in America, but you know, any White House, there's going to be people behind the scenes that are having quite a bit of influence.
One of the interesting things about, well, administrations up until fairly recently, until the computer, we're sitting on top of 46 million sheets of paper. And one of the, because President Nixon liked to work off paper, these people like, particularly John Whitaker and Charlie DeBona, and their offices produced quantities of paper that you can read and you can study. And because Nixon had sort of this copious interest in an open mind, he was interested in ideas. And so some of the things, and particularly on energy, we were talking earlier, that early message, he was talking about solar and geothermal and sort of foreshadowing fracking. I mean, some very interesting and original work was done in the Nixon staff.
Yeah, these ideas had real world consequences, because back when President Nixon came in, almost 100% of our energy research budget was at the Atomic Energy Commission, and it was devoted to nuclear. And so what he proposed, and you heard this in his speech, was the Energy Research and Development Administration, which had been taken out of the Atomic Energy Commission and then fairly soon thereafter became part of the Department of Energy. And basically the mandate was, we've got all these smart people here, and probably they should be spending most of their time on nuclear energy, but not all of their time. So this, President Nixon is the first president to authorize research into solar. And ERDA was the place that when George Mitchell started developing fracking in Texas, he had a lot of interaction with the government. And if you hadn't had that step where we moved away from the energy labs being 100% nuclear, you wouldn't have had fracking, you wouldn't have had the development of photovoltaic cells and all of that. So these are all things that sort of develop over several presidencies. But if you trace back the roots, they almost all go back to the Nixon administration. And actually what people don't realize, people think energy started with the Arab oil embargo, but I think one of the good things about what Frank's put together here tonight is to point that a lot of thinking actually was going on before the Arab oil embargo, and that's what's maybe even more impressive.
John, you were present at the creation of the Federal Energy Office. There were a number of attempts by Nixon to sort of, in terms of staff, to organize energy policy or information. What was FEO and what made it unique? What made it important?
Yeah, I sort of regret having said arguably critical things about John Love being the outstanding man that he was, and he was extremely good to me. But in March of 1973, to my surprise, Peter Flanagan probably knew, Charlie DeBona was essentially hired by John Ehrlichman. And Charlie also is a Naval Academy graduate. He's probably 8 or 10 years older than me. I retained my White House office and all my privileges, but I went to work in theory for Charlie. And he and I got along great. I certainly didn't think I was going to be running anything. I was a staff assistant, so it sort of didn't matter to me, although I was certainly very appreciative and loyal to Peter. Anyway, the energy message only came out like 6 weeks after Charlie got there. So it was in drafting, certainly for weeks before it was issued. And long story short, Charlie had no impact on that. He wasn't brought over for his energy expertise. He came from the Center for Naval Analysis. But for some reason, the president sidelined Flanagan, who, like I say, was primarily the visionary. And for me, obvious reasons, he brought in John Love, and I don't know why he did that. And Governor Love didn't seem to know why he did that either. And so about that time when Love came in June of '73, and I'm sure Charlie DeBona was stunned because he thought he was the head of the Energy Policy Office, and now John Love was there. And Charlie, being another first-class human being, he said, "Of course, Governor, what can I do for you?" Anyway, at that time, Bill Simon basically adopted me because I had been working with all of these task forces that Peter was in charge of. But most of these task forces had input from state, from the National Security Council, from Treasury, from Bill Simon. So Bill was one of the president's key advisors. And Bill perceived a power vacuum, not in a bad way, but in a how can I help the president in the country? And we were having real propane shortages that were mostly economically driven. And then we were expecting a residual fuel oil and home heating oil shortage. And actually, Charlie did some testifying on that. So my personal belief is from the energy message on, Bill began a very deliberate, benevolent process of taking over energy policy. And he did. And then the Arab oil embargo happened. So, as you know, you knew a lot of staff assistants. There was just something about the job. It wasn't about me, but I was sent to the Congress many times, and I testified. I only testified 4 or 5 times, but on the legislation that was passed in response to the Arab oil embargo. And by the way, the Arab oil embargo in 1973 was like COVID in 2020. It was everything. And the president essentially said that. Every news station, every night. Okay. And we ended up with gas lines. So I was actually sent up to the Senate to represent the administration as a 30-year-old staff assistant to the president. I have no idea why. Maybe it was because the administration and the Senate were in complete agreement. So Bill then was made the second energy czar after Governor Love and took over the new federally created Federal Energy Office, which in less than a year became the FEA, the Federal Energy Administration, which 7 or 8 years later became the Department of Energy. And he put me in charge of the fuel program. So I literally moved into General Grant's office in the Winder building, which was right outside your window.
Yep.
Right across the street from the old executive office building, and began a process under Bill's direction, but according to the newly passed law that the president signed, of beginning to try and allocate fuels.
I think it's fair to Governor Love to say that Nixon perceived that it was reaching a critical mass and it was going to need a public face. And Governor Love, having been a successful governor in Colorado, fit that bill. I don't know the details, but one could deduce that he wasn't prepared for the snake bit of Washington on an issue that had so many aspects, and so he didn't fill the bill, and I think he felt that as well. And whereas someone like Bill Simon had the qualities that were needed to become a public face of the administration's energy policy. Brings us to Bill Simon.
Well, they had two very different personalities. I mean, I don't know how the family feels about this, but my observation of Secretary Simon is that he's a workaholic. You know, he worked these long hours, and you know, he told one time he testified before Congress, and he got in some accident, and so he just had these stitches put in, and he still showed up for his congressional testimony. And he also cultivated the press. I mean, if you go to the Simon Archives at Lafayette and look at his daily schedule, there's a lot of time there spent with reporters. He would invite, old people my age might remember Evans and Novak, the very influential political columnists. He would have them over to dinner, you know, at the White Treasury mess and whatever. And Love was just the opposite. He didn't like dealing with the press. And one time, Simon took some shots at him and said, he said he was going to go hunting for a long weekend, and we got this big energy crisis out. How could he have time to go hunting? So there's all these interesting stories that you run across, but you know, you have to admire, the world is changing in the early 70s. I guess maybe it's always changing, but you know, who remembers Colonel Gaddafi these days? But he comes to power the first year of the Nixon administration. You have the Santa Barbara oil spill the first year of the Nixon administration. And with Gaddafi, what you have is a whole change of attitude of the OPEC nations. And they realize, particularly after Gaddafi gets away with a few things, that they can ratchet up the price. And then they eventually realized they could actually take over the ownership of these international oil companies. Well, the fact that these international oil companies had kind of ruled the roost was a tremendous protective layer for the United States in international relations. And then now all of a sudden these new nations, or these emerging nations were seizing control. So things were just changing here and there, and it's fun to see all the wrestling and the thought, and my judgment as an outsider is the quality of that thought, both in public and in private. I mean, when they were discussing lifting the oil import quotas, they authorized, the Schultz Commission had a study. They had 10,000 pages of testimony. So it makes it hard for historians when they do that. But the quality of the discussion is very, very high, even when they're not always right. I mean, it's easy for us in hindsight to go back and say, you know, maybe they should have done this or that. But they were operating in real time, and they were addressing these in some ways, I think, in a more serious way than they get addressed today.
What was the lie of the land in terms of sort of the personnel? Who were the lead players on the Hill? Were there people in media or academia that were sort of thought leaders? There was Small is Beautiful was published around this time. I mean, there was a cult. Well, and the Ford Foundation, the result of a detailed
That was 74, probably.
Yeah, and their thing was that the growth is not necessary. Non-growth is an option. So there was this idea that growth is not good, energy is not good. What was the counterculture like on this? And was it formed, and was it sufficiently formed to play a part or to be a gadfly?
Well, I don't know if this is directly responsive to your question, but to me, looking back, the big chasm was nuclear energy. Nixon, in hindsight, maybe was a little bit carried away with what the breeder reactor could do, which was it was a bigger form of nuclear energy that didn't, on a net basis, use uranium. It created more energy than it used, and devoted a lot of attention to that. But then you had what I would call an irresponsible attack on nuclear energy, and shut them down and whatever. So I guess maybe it's current to maybe the type of NIMBY problems we have today. You know, I don't want a nuclear plant in my backyard. So the emergence of this in terms of now, you know, Nixon was so pro-environment. I mean, administration officials were going out and participating in Earth Day, and some of these statements on the environment actually took place before Earth Day. So you know, I think he was pretty solid on that flank. But he did, in the tapes a couple of times, he told Whitaker, he said, "These environmentalists drive me up the tree." But when the historic rankings came out a few years ago, Nixon was ranked #2 in entire presidential history on the environment. Teddy Roosevelt was #1. So it's an interesting time because everything's up for grabs because all the issues are kind of new.
There's a meeting that the president had. It was with the it was with business leaders in the state dining room, so it wasn't taped, unfortunately, but notes were taken. And he says that the environmentalists are very, and the interesting thing about Nixon too was because he was in early on the environment, an environmental leader, the environmental aspect of energy control put him involved in that. And so he was very sympathetic to the environmentalists, and yet he felt they could go too far. And he says that some of them, a lot of them are very good, but if some of them you left them on their own, will end up rubbing two sticks together for energy. So.
Frank, you mentioned the Congress. I think that there was a clear leader in the Congress, and that was Senator Scoop Jackson. Harley Staggers on the House side was supposedly his peer, but it was Jackson, even more so on energy issues with NEPA and the Clean Air Act. The EPA was begun in the Nixon administration. It was an act that had to be passed by Congress. Council on Environmental Quality was a guy by the name of Al Ohm. And that was his passion, and I'm guessing, I mean, they were senators together. They knew each other well. So it was Jackson, and I will say it's really important that I think it's the only time it's ever been done. The reason the Alaska Pipeline bill passed was because the Congress deemed that it fulfilled all the requirements of NEPA. The Congress basically prohibited lawsuits, and that's what allowed the Alaska Pipeline to proceed.
Yeah, that's one of those big victories. It's interesting because the administration predicted that the Alaska Pipeline would produce 2 million barrels a day at its peak, which they hit the bullseye. That's exactly what the peak was. And it makes another point that I like to make in presidential history, that presidents are faced with issues that will produce political dividends while they're still in office, and others that will accrue to the national benefit only after they leave office. And so the test is, are things done that have a lasting value? So the first deliveries through the Alaska Pipeline occurred in 1977. So Carter got some benefit from it. It actually made it a little bit easier for him to deal with the Iranian Revolution and the later outbreak of the Iran and Iraq War, and Reagan got a lot of benefit from it. But Nixon used a lot of political chits to get that passed. And I would say on the Scoop Jackson thing, it's another illustration of how things are always more complicated than we think they were. Scoop Jackson is viewed inside the Beltway as the strongest Democratic presidential candidate in 1972 against Nixon. So when Nixon's dealing with Jackson, this may be his rival in the next election. But those two had an amazing ability to sort of do their business anyway. Jackson, just days after a really over-the-top speech criticizing the Nixon administration for not being aware of the instability in Saudi Arabia and Iran, and they weren't taking this seriously, and just blasting the administration. A couple days later, they have a meeting in the Oval Office, and they're chatting and you know, very civil and sort of intellectually stimulating, actually. So now he didn't have that kind of relationship with Ed Muskie. Ed Muskie was the big senator on the Clean Air Act. And on the Clean Air Act, that was one of the great achievements of the Nixon administration, and it was a great achievement for Muskie. But Nixon didn't invite Muskie to the signing ceremony. So, you know, there's all these personalities sort of going on, but it's interesting to take a multifaceted approach to both read the news coverage, to read the documents, and listen to the tapes. And when you put the three of them together, you sometimes can sort of piece things together as best you can. I mean, even the president probably doesn't know everything that's going on at the White House. So it's a fun puzzle to kind of play with.
It was interesting. Nixon was the first president in 120 years since Zachary Taylor in 1849 not to have at least one House of Congress with him in his first term. He didn't have either House of Congress with him for any of his 6 years. And the 68 election had been so close that the Democrats were feeling that especially if Teddy Kennedy had run, at any rate, it was not sure that Nixon would be a second-term president. One of the people most conscious of that was Nixon. But but still in that first term, there was a remarkable amount of domestic legislation passed, because there was still this sort of concept of, as you're saying, you can be political rivals, but where a national interest or a good thing is involved, people will cross the aisle and will vote. And,
you know, the Clean Air Act, which had a lot, I mean, you talk about getting rid of sulfur from gasoline and lead and how that disrupts the whole energy system. The Clean Air Act passed on a voice vote. They didn't even have a recorded vote, because by the time they'd compromised this and that and done all the compromises, there were no opposing votes. That's kind of hard to imagine, that a bill of that consequence would just pass on a voice vote. But it was a different era, and in some ways it's quite healthy, because you know, President Nixon knew that he had to be realistic about where the Congress was coming from, and they had to be realistic that he was a president that had a lot of credibility and was reelected by a very large margin.
This is the kind of question I hate to be asked, and so I'm in the position to ask it, or hate to have to be asked to have to answer, but I'm in a position to ask it. If Watergate had not happened, or if it had happened differently, and he had not been hobbled in the second term, and the second term was remarkable, one of the three greatest landslides in history, and so a man who was the best prepared for this job and was finally elected with the landslide and the mandate, and with ideas about reorganizing the government. One of the principal ones was he was going to create this Department of Natural Resources, which he had been trying to get passed since the early days of his administration. And each time he would send up these new things of environmental legislation that would be in there, and it kept getting ignored. So if he would have had problems, obviously, but if Watergate hadn't hobbled him, in this field of energy, where he was an enlightened and interested man, what might have happened?
I think it's hard to disentangle all of the factors involved, but inflation was a big deal. And here's a strong comparison to Carter, because Carter also, if you look at the periods in American history where inflation was just raging, it was the beginning of President Nixon's second term and President Carter, particularly in 1979. So often we say Carter lost because of the Shah was overthrown, or Nixon lost because of Watergate. I think I play these what-if games in my mind, and I don't know what the answer to them is. If the inflation had not been so severe, would the Congress have felt at liberty to proceed as far as they did on the Watergate hearings? Because I think in that situation, a president whose approval ratings are very high would be less vulnerable to that kind of investigation. This is just speculation on my part, but I'm somewhat of an economic determinist about election results, and you notice most elected officials get pretty nervous when there's high inflation. And for good reason. And what President Nixon had done was he had put in the price controls to control inflation, and they'd worked almost better than anyone expected. And at the end of the first term, every economist, liberal, conservative, said, well, this worked really well, and nothing bad seemed to happen. And then all of a sudden, it kind of burst. And as President Nixon said, here, agriculture was part of that too. But behind big inflations, you usually find there's some increased energy problems in the background. And this turmoil in the Mideast, where all of a sudden we were getting that oil, at bargain prices, and all of a sudden it went way up. That really hurt. So I don't know that you can. I think that's a great question, but it's above my pay grade.
You want to venture in, John? I was given the direct authority for all the fuel, and I was the signatory authority on Simon's orders. I had instantly I was given a general counsel who came from the Justice Department, who went off and recruited, 15 other attorneys, including 7 or 8 administrative law judges. I mean, we put 700 people into the Winder building in 6 weeks, all from other agencies. And like the COVID times, we had no idea what was going to happen. And I'm sure the president, I can't speak for what the president felt, but I know Bill Simon was afraid of what might happen, all right? And we had a law that the president had signed that said we were going to start allocating fuel, and it was to be done by state, all right? And the premise was that we were going to start off at about 90%. And some states were going to be more and some states were going to be less. And we didn't begin that until January. And it was called a tops-down system. When Scoop Jackson's staff people started working on this concept, they wanted the government to figure out what everybody needed. Well, that was impossible, particularly in that period of time. So the basic concept was we told all levels of fuel distribution to go back to their January 1972 customer relationships and supply those people basically 90% of what you supplied them in 1972, which was really rather a brilliant concept because it took into account seasonability. So this can be a long story, but on the Arab oil embargo, if you really look at it from perspective, and some of this came up in our Zoom call with Jay, and I would guess he'll agree with me. First of all, it was very short. October 6th, Saudi Arabia declared it was over on March 19th. We saw that. It was actually over in February. Why was it over in February? Because of economics, because supply and demand. Okay, so what happened was, and by the way, an important footnote, I'm sure when Jay was running the EIA, it was a very different organization, but in 1972 and 73, oil statistics in the government, production statistics, were kept by the Office of Oil and Gas, and they were inept, totally unreliable. I got so frustrated with them, John Larson was the Undersecretary of Interior, and his chief of staff was a guy everyone in the room has heard of by the name of Ken Lay. So I actually went over and met with Larson and Lay and got the head of the statistics group in there and told them, I said, you know, you guys are incompetent. So
We fixed that.
So long story short, I was getting pressured by both Governor Love and Bill Simon to find out what our oil imports were and to understand what was going on because of potential fuel shortages. And the Office of Oil and Gas couldn't help me, but somebody could. It's called the API. The American Petroleum Institute had accurate statistics, and we found that out, all right? So, December of 73, we were in 10 days into this, and it was a Friday evening, and the press was full of news about gas lines. It was as bad as any COVID news you ever saw. And I am sure the president was all over Bill Simon. I don't know what he thought Bill could do. So Bill and I talked, and he said, I'm going to send you down to Florida. Florida was the worst, and then New Jersey and New York. Most states had no gas lines, at least 35 or 40. So, and this is almost humorous, so I think it was Bob Johnson who went with me. They sent us on one of the small presidential planes. We left early in the morning from Andrews. We got into the Naples area about 7. Somebody met us. I assume it was a Treasury person, probably ATF, just so we had wheels. We went to 3 gas stations there, and then we flew up to Tampa. We went to 3 more gas stations. I probably talked to 80 people. At least 75% of them were men over 65. They were out on Saturday morning drinking coffee, talking to their buddies. So I asked them, every one of them, anybody have an empty tank? No. They were in line, all right, they were in line because they didn't want to have an empty tank. So as I flew back, I think it was with Bob Johnson, I said, I think I know how to cut the lines in half. And he said, how? And I said, let's have even and odd days based on the last number in your license plate, or if it's a letter, whatever, the number. So we walked in, we told Bill Simon, he said, done, do that. And the lines were cut in half, just that quickly. So what was going on was we were only getting about 1 million barrels a day from the Middle East. We were getting 3 million from OPEC, but only 1 million from, and we knew that, which gets to an interesting statistical thing. And we got that data from the API. But as Jay said on our conference call, without anybody in the government telling our oil companies what to do, they basically made up for it by getting a little more from Venezuela, which was supposedly operating under the embargo, or from Trinidad and Tobago that wasn't, or from Mexico or whatever. So basically, we never knew. We probably did not lose 1 million barrels a day. We may have lost half of that. But just like the president said, you know, most major offices and department stores had lowered their thermostats. People weren't going to drive from Jacksonville to Tampa to see mom necessarily on the weekend, which gets to an important point. So on one hand, the American public probably cut back by at least 10%, which is a big number. It is a big number, all right? And the supplies really were not lost. So an interesting footnote, before Christmas, we learned from the API that virtually all of the gas stations on the interstates were full, and they were refusing deliveries. So think about that. So you're in Jacksonville and you want to go see mom. You think, well, I got to fill up before I go, and then when I get to see mom, I have to fill up again. And they drive right by the interstate stations. So this got to a huge strategic issue. Basically, we knew, Bill Simon knew, Richard Nixon knew. Oh, by the way, the CIA checked with the 6 or 8 major European countries on their receipt of fuel, period. It did not decline. So before Christmas of '73, Bill knew, and I'm sure the president knew, but very few people knew, we actually didn't have a shortage. We knew we didn't have a shortage. So why didn't we tell the American people? We were afraid we would get a shortage. All right? So if you tell the Saudis, if Nixon said, oh, by the way, guys, it ain't working, I mean, everything's fine in Europe and we're doing great.
On that note, we have a subtly eloquent direction here on this monitor. It says rap. So
that's better than crap.
It is. Joe, I keep calling you Jay. Summing up, Richard Nixon's. What should people today know about Richard Nixon's energy legacy?
Well, I go back to the statement, part of the statement he made tonight, that energy policy has to include the economy, national security, and the environment. And I keep repeating those words, and maybe it sounds kind of simple, but when you look at some proposals, they don't take into account all three. So I think he was extremely thoughtful. I think he surrounded himself with a lot of talented people. And I argue that that period should be also viewed as a bit of a laboratory because they were inventing new things. And so rather than to be all in favor of regulation or 100% against regulation, the devil's in the details. Just let me add one thing on these gasoline lines. The way the price system worked was the retail price was adjusted at the end of each month. So the last week of the month, the retail dealer would know that the oil in a couple of days would be worth 7 cents more a gallon than it was today. Now, is it a coincidence that the lines appeared at the end of the month? So, you know, but again, they're inventing new things. So let's go back and learn what worked and didn't work, and we'll all be the better for it.
Please join me in thanking the Simon Foundation, the Nixon Foundation, and Joe and John for an enlightening evening.
Relax, because I'm going to pay you a compliment. My name is Bill Simon, Jr., and it's been a thrill for me to be here with these gentlemen, John and Jay and Frank, but also it's been a thrill to bookend this evening with my beloved brother Pete. And, you know, I have a lot of... You know, Dad was a legend in so many ways, and what we haven't heard tonight, and I'll talk very briefly, is some of the personal aspects, because he and Mom had 7 children, and it's not only a thrill, but it's a privilege to be a member of this family, to see Dad's name up here together with President Nixon's name. I mean, I just got to pinch myself, and I've had the opportunity to come down here to the library on many occasions. As some of you may know, I ran for public office out here, which was great. And the Nixon Library was always front and center, professional, serious. And when I had the chance to see this wonderful place after this amazing renovation, I said to myself, they're still serious, intentional, and a group of people, you know, led by Jim and Jameson and Brenda, that are so responsible. I think that President Nixon, these gentlemen, my dad, our dad, you know, would be extremely, extremely happy. We got a tour, Pete and I did, our first time seeing the library since it was renovated, and it just sent chills down my spine. So you all have heard plenty about energy tonight. You're going to hear plenty tomorrow, because that's what the Nixon Library is all about: public policy, leadership. And this year is a big year for the Nixon Library. Why is that? Because it's the 50th anniversary, not just of the oil embargo, but the Yom Kippur War, the return of our prisoners of war. Many important things happened 50 years ago, and God bless the Nixon Library and everybody associated with it, all of you that came here this evening, to recognize the importance of the past, but also to look to the future. So I hope you enjoyed the evening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks to the staff of the foundation and the staff of the William E. Simon Foundation, led by Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Frank.